Just a bit of housekeeping for a second. My colleague Caitlin in a moment is going to share some slides just to set up a bit of the historical context. If when she starts sharing the slides you can't see them, you basically have two options. Well, it's three really, but two options. One, if you log out and log back in, that usually does it. Or you can log out and then click onto the YouTube channel, our YouTube channel, to watch it there. If you do that, then obviously you won't be able to post questions, but you will be able to watch. You can keep your login on Zoom as well if you wish, if you want to come to questions. And obviously your third option is that you just ignore the slides and wait for us to get to the panel discussion. So those are our three basic options if you can't see the slides once we start going. Sometimes there's a few glitches for some of you. But before we get to Caitlin and her slides, let me just introduce our esteemed panel. So we've got Hugh Merriman, who's chair of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway Partnership Board and former Minister of State for Transport under the previous government. We've got Silviya Barrett, who's Director of Policy and Campaigns at the Campaign for Better Transport. And we've got Anne Shaw, who's Executive Director of Transport for West Midlands. So our panel will be with us very shortly. But to kick off and provide a bit of historical context, given we are part of the Railway200 programme, my colleague Caitlin Rollison is going to share some slides and give the big picture long-term view on urban transport and how it's affected urban development over the last 200 years. So Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and hello, everyone. As Andrew said, I'm just sharing my slides. You should be able to see them right now, and if you can, please take one of the options Andrew outlined, and I can see the link to the YouTube in the chat. And I obviously prefer that you don't take option 3 because we do have some fun little bits of rail history and some economic insights coming up. So that should be the slides with you now. Before I kind of hand to the panel, what I'm just going to do is set the scene. So we're going to go through why we're here today. That's, of course, the 200th anniversary of the modern railway. And we're going to go through a little bit of what that means for our urban economies then and now. So obviously, starting kind of probably taking lots of you back to high school or economic geography 101, 200 years ago in 1825, we had the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. No photos, so you can see a painting sort of impression of the time on the left there. This was the first public railway in the world. It was intended to transport coal from the collieries. And interestingly for us in today's discussion, it also had a special passenger carriage called the Experiment, which is of course a slightly threatening name for a passenger train, but there you go. And then 5 years later in 1830, which is of course useful for us because we'll get to do all this again in 5 years, we had the opening of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. And this is really, I think, the first sort of formal railway run as sort of as planned rather than as a trial. It was commissioned by factory owners, again, to transport the raw materials and to make that faster and cheaper. But in this case, from the outset, it was designed to carry passengers as well. And what it did was dramatically reduce the travel times for those goods and passengers. So the same journey by canal was 20 hours, by road was about 4 hours, and by rail reduced to 1 hour and 45 minutes. And just as a little side note, the journey time today is now on average 53 minutes. So it has actually reduced since then. I'm sure you'll all be pleased to know. So that's kind of the outset of the railways in the UK. And now looking at how these went to reshape our cities, I think the first important thing to note is that, you know, in some respects, the growth of the population of the economy at the time sort of influenced where the railways went. But the reverse is also true. We can look at studies and we know that where the railways were built and where they were expanded to actually shaped the economies and the population of our cities. This is particularly true from the 1840s onwards, where you had something called rail mania, which was a significant expansion of the network. And here, when you look at where the railways were built, you can see higher population and secondary and tertiary employment growth. And these effects were even stronger where you already had medium density or where you had raw materials. In other words, as we put it today, the railways were working with the agglomeration economies of those cities. And they were helping them to become more productive and to increase the jobs on offer. And that particularly goes for jobs in what we'd today consider to be the service industries, although today, at that time it was obviously slightly different. And alongside that, obviously, communication became much more quicker and much more reliable between the cities. You had post and you had the telegram. And I'm not going to go into details of the study, but I have referenced it there. It's really good for anyone who wants to dive deeper into this issue. So from the 1840s and that railway mania onwards, you really had the significant expansion of the network, and you start to see it take the shape that we know roughly today. You can see there in that 1881 diagram that all of the kind of major cities are connected, and you have the trunk routes that we would expect to see today all in place. Although you also might, of course, see more railways than you see in today's network, which kind of brings me on to the next part of the discussion, which is moving onwards through the next century until the 1950s, you had roughly a continued period of expansion and modernization, obviously give or take that during the two world wars and other factors. However, then come the 1960s, and the story for public transport and the railway network really starts to change, as it does for kind of how that relates to our economies. So you had two factors here. The first, and I'm sure it's kind of the first that comes to mind for many of the people who are here to hear about railway history today, is of course in 1963 you had the Beeching Report, which earmarked 5,000 miles of track and 2,000 stations for closure. And I think that's the most well-known example of its kind, but it was actually just one of several reports proposing reducing the UK's railway network. But this wasn't happening in isolation. This was happening concurrently with the rise of the private car as a mode of transport. From the 1950s onwards, car ownership became accessible to kind of the average household and actually increased fivefold between 1950 and 1970. And you can see in the modes in the chart that what happens here is car became more common. The most significant decline you can see is actually in bus and coach rather than rail. And this really reflects the fact that cars took over transport within cities, so those shorter journeys that commute to work within your city. Whereas rail, despite the shrinking network at times, did actually still remain kind of the fastest and most convenient choice when it came to some of those longer distance journeys between cities. And I think that's the pattern that we continue to see to this day, give or take, depending on obviously the journey and the location, where it's really the car that dominates within our cities and for the commute. And this went on to reshape the urban form of our cities. So I've illustrated it here with the M8 going through central Glasgow and with the Westway in London. And of course, road building projects like this did have some of the positive impacts that you would expect from the initial rise of the railways. So it made, transport for goods and for people faster. It contributed to economic growth. But around the same time, we also start to see, I think, the first recognition of the negative impacts of reliance on private car travel. And at that time, it came in the form of congestion, pollution, and the destruction, obviously, of local communities and separation of communities that occurred as a result of these inner city motorway building projects. And the reason that I've chosen these two examples here is if you're familiar with these cities, you'll know that although Glasgow almost completed its inner city road network, it didn't quite. And London, of course, the Westway is kind of the remnant of what should have been a much bigger ring road project, but was stopped due to local opposition. And that's right from the 1960s onwards. So that kind of brings us back to the present day, leaving us with what we currently have, where private car travel accounts for 90% of journeys. You can see that particularly that bus and coach travel share has been in steady decline since the 1950s, and you can see that rail has remained a little bit more consistent. And then for all modes, you can also see the expected sudden dip during the pandemic, followed by a recovery. But I think what's really important to note here is that that recovery is only going back towards a declining baseline, particularly when it comes to bus and coach, but also for rail. And the other important thing to note here is that this isn't just a story about how we choose to travel. It's also a story about the economics, the urban economies of the UK. So we know that transport is one of the factors preventing UK cities from reaching their full potential and offering more of those agglomeration benefits in the same way that the railways did for industry in the 1800s. So we also see that when we compare the UK with Europe. Those dotted lines you can see on the chart there are the average travel time to the city centre, the average share of people who can reach the city centre in big European cities. And those green bars there are the share of people that can reach the city centre within 30 minutes for the UK cities. So you can see with the exception of Glasgow, which nearly meets the line, they are all falling below the European average. And this kind of poor connectivity actually contributes to a net productivity loss of 23.1 billion for the UK economy. And even putting that aside, you also have transport being the second largest source of emissions in the UK. So that kind of leaves us with where we are today and leads nicely onto the discussion. But just to round things off, the things that I'm looking out for and that we at Centre for Cities looking out for kind of upcoming are the shift we're starting to see back towards, in many ways, the sort of transport projects that we saw in the 1800s and early 1900s. We've seen announcement for investment, including the very first or second railway line, the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, in the recent spending review. We've seen a return to regulated bus networks, and we've also seen a return to local leadership that in some ways mirrors what regional railway companies and industrialists were doing in the 1800s, obviously in a different context, but still. And in those cities that are more developed, we've also seen kind of a return to active travel and investment in cycling infrastructure. So it's interesting to see this kind of back to the future trend. And I think what I personally am really interested to see and what we're looking out for is also whether we're going to see this investment in these policies that are shifting us back to public transport accompanied by policies that are going to shift the balance away from the dominance of the private car. So I will kind of stop sharing now and hand back to the panel. But if anyone has any questions specifically on our research or on these slides, I will be in the Q&A for the rest of the event.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caitlin. Great overview. Reminds us, as in many other sort of fields of endeavour and activity, the UK was a world leader once. Other places, other countries came to see what we were doing. Sadly, we've lost that position over time, and maybe we are in the process of trying to recapture it, but also increasingly looking to where other places and other cities in particular have really made big progress on their urban transport questions and how we take them forward. So it's a good reminder of that. The other thing to say is if you've got any queries or questions, as Caitlin said, stick them in the Q&A. I'll feed them into the conversation. We could undoubtedly have a full session on the trials and tribulations of HS2, but we're not going to do that because that's often discussed elsewhere. So by all means, have that in your mind, but I will probably ignore questions on HS2 if you are so minded to submit them, because I think we're trying to get beyond that, but particularly thinking about the dynamics that are going on within our urban areas, and particularly our bigger urban areas, and those big urban areas that are relatively close to each other and what the pairing might do. So just thinking about that, I think is helpful. We have to create some boundaries somewhere. So let's hear from our panel. Let's start with you, Hugh. So we're gonna do this. Firstly, a sort of big picture set of reflections from you. You know, the state of urban transport, etc., and then we'll dive into the detail and get into some of the specifics. So Hugh, give us your big picture reflections first off.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks so much to you and to Caitlin and the team for the opportunity. So as you said at the start, I chair the Liverpool-Manchester Railway Partnership Board, and I know we're going to come back to that, but you know, to me, this is all about making sure that a railway isn't a set of tracks, but is the opportunity to economically regenerate the city, deliver a workforce, and deliver the sort of new homes, new jobs, the skills, the energy, actually now, as well as getting people from A to B. But we'll talk more about that in a bit. I wanted to pick up where Caitlin had taken us in terms of effectively the rise of the car, but also to demonstrate that it can be different, notwithstanding the car, and we can get ourselves back to public transport and active travel using an example. So back in 1952, we had under 30% of all of our distance travelled by car. That figure is now 85%, as I had it, albeit I think Caitlin was showing 90%. It used to be the case in 1952 that 42% of distance was travelled by bus or coach. That's now 5%, and 17% by train. That's now down to 7%. So obviously the car took over, as Caitlin demonstrated, and impacted other modes of transport, to the point that in 2023, 66% of all commuters were using their car to get to work. But here's where the outlier is, because whilst 79%, the highest regional figure for car commute, was in the East Midlands, 26% of Londoners or those around London were commuting via car. And that takes us back to our sort of under 30% figure as it was in 1952. So I want to reflect a bit on what London has been able to do, and more importantly, what other cities can do by using that example. Because again, if you take active travel and public transport, then you'll find that it completely dwarfs car usage. And in my view, the reason why London has been a success is around devolution and why we need to do more of it. It has an overarching transport strategy. It devolves power. It has Transport for London, which has the ability to pull the levers and effectively sort of nudge for change and share space. But that can also mean policies such as congestion charging that disincentivizes the car. And I wrote a report when I chaired the Transport Select Committee on road pricing. And I'd like us to go further and really sort of not just charge people to come into a zone, but charge people per mile they actually travel it. And of course, then it gets investment off the back of that. So Crossrail being a huge success, 1 in 7 of all rail journeys is on Crossrail now. And that has also directly led to 55,000 new homes. So it just shows build it and they will come, but not just they, but also the houses as well. So I'll stop there because I've just hit 3 minutes, but I know there's a lot more for us to talk about. But I think my overriding point is we can actually get back to where we need to be, because London shows that those figures still exist, but we need the other cities to be able to do what London has been able to offer.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hugh. A great point around it's not inevitable, in the sense of the patterns that we see are not inevitable or some, just come out of magic. They are the result of decisions that are made or indeed actually not made. And I think that's a really good point. And in our urban areas, there are different options and choices available to us. And let's come to you next. And just, again, your kind of big picture reflections before we dive into the detail.
Yeah, so I would absolutely agree with Hugh that devolution is the way to make sure that local transport in city regions delivers broader outcomes, not just about moving people around, but also to help with tackling housing shortages and things like that as well, and getting more people to travel sustainably. So if I just say in the West Midlands, obviously 1% of our share of modal trips is by rail. We obviously are trying to do something about that, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about in the conversation, Andrew. And certainly 10% of our journeys are by local bus as well. But overall, we're seeing percentages of 97% of all trips are made on the public highway. So when you think about the impact of congestion on our local economy, the impact of that on environmental, air quality, here in the West Midlands, we've got a clean air zone in the middle of Birmingham city centre, which is having some of the impacts that Hugh was talking about, that TfL have been able to bring in. And we're trying to work through all of our strategic plans to look at how we can incentivise people to use public transport to move around and active travel, and de-incentivise single occupancy car journeys where they are just not necessary. They can be made in a different way as well. Devolution has been the key to that. Long-term funding as well through city regions sustainable transport settlements, now called Transport City Regions funding, which will take us through to 2032, I think it is. It means that we can make more strategic choices about how we plan transport, but because TfWM, Transport for West Midlands, is part of a combined authority. It's not just about transport, it's about how do we support the economy, how do we make sure that we can deliver the housing targets that we've got in this region, provide people with decent homes, how can we connect people to their education, to their places of work, and more importantly, how can we encourage local businesses or businesses to invest in this region as well. And a good functioning transport system is key to that as well. So devolution is absolutely helping us on that journey.
Brilliant, excellent, really good. And I'd say compliments what Hugh said, but also I think introducing some interesting dynamics which Hugh touched on as well, which is about the balance and the relationship between, what we often refer to as carrots and sticks, in the sense that we have to think about these two things working together in order to get some of the shifts and the changes in behaviours and patterns of engagement that we really need, which we can definitely come back to as well. Silviya, round us off with your sort of big picture initial set of comments and reflections.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know Campaign for Better Transport, we're the national non-government organization that advocates for cleaner, greener, more sustainable transport. We were established in 1973, just as Caitlin elaborated, people were beginning to realize the negative impacts of car dependency. We were established to campaign against rail cuts, against the building of big roads that would have cut through the center of our cities, and advocating against the negative impacts in terms of emissions, in terms of congestion. So one thing that is often forgotten is that public transport really helps reduce congestion, and that supports economic growth by speeding up journeys for everyone who uses public transport and for businesses that do need to use the roads as required. So some of the big changes that we have seen have had a negative impact. We can argue that we have seen a revival of the understanding of the importance of sustainable public transport. What we did see with the pitching cuts, for example, but also with the removal of trams and metro system in the center of our cities in the 70s, is how this really perhaps reduced productivity, but also exacerbated social exclusion. So I think one of the most important things about public transport is that it not only supports the economy, it presents also very, very good value for money in terms of investment. So money invested in bus networks, in rail, in trams, really has much higher returns of rates of return than road building, for example. So we're trying to make sure that investment focuses on sustainable public transport. But also public transport investment has the potential to really improve public health, to improve social cohesion, to reduce the discrepancies between regions, and boost that sort of community infrastructure as well. So as I said, we're hoping that we're seeing that revival of the understanding of the importance of public transport, and there's certainly many big reform processes happening at the moment. We have massive process of reform in the rail sector with the movement of rail operators under public ownership, the creation of Great British Railways. We have massive reform in buses as well, with a bus bill currently going through Parliament, which will enable more local authorities to franchise bus services, for example. But we can talk about the question of how many will be able to take advantage of these new powers. And of course, all this is happening while we have big planning reforms, big devolution agenda progressing as well, which is also positive. But there's a big question about how that then interrelates with a parallel process of local government reorganization, for example, where smaller district councils will be asked to merge into bigger unitaries. And that will completely reshape the geography of decision making and transport delivery as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Silviya. So good set of sort of big picture reflections. Let's dive into a bit, maybe pick up some of the things that you're more closely involved in. Hugh, let's come back to you. Liverpool, Manchester is a good example of what we're trying to think about, right? Which is two big places that are not sufficiently connected, both in terms of frequency, reliability, speed, etc. You've been part of a program to think about unlocking the benefits of better connections. So it's not the focus on the line and the track per se, as you said, but actually what it means and what it enables. So just say something about why you think that's such an important scheme, and we can get into some of the detail. And similarly, we'll get Anne to say a little bit about how what's going on in terms of the West Midlands metro extension, how that sort of fits into a bigger picture about the role of urban transport. Hugh.
Yeah, so I mean, it's incredibly important because the Northwest has outgrown the rest of the UK, with the exception of London, in terms of productivity and growth. But it's going to get maxed out in the same way that people talk about East-West Rail with Oxford and Cambridge, that its growth is going to be constrained. And of course, actually, I'll take Oxford and Cambridge as an example because another railway close to my heart in terms of work I did on it. Cambridge will not be able to compete with the likes of Boston, Singapore, in terms of the sort of innovators, the pioneers, because you need a whole workforce to make a lab. And so, that project, East West Rail, is all about delivering a workforce into Oxford and Cambridge because they're so constrained. And we have the same challenges with Manchester and Liverpool. So the line of route there will be Manchester Piccadilly, which we hope to be an underground station, which would free up about 40 acres of prime real estate redevelopment around Piccadilly and regenerate that area. Then it moves to Manchester Airport, the aim to connect all of East West to Manchester Airport. So our ambition is to see it go all the way to Hull in terms of Northern Powerhouse Rail. Then across to Warrington, a growing town where there's a lot of house building plans. We'd see new towns on the line of route connecting to the stations. Then to a new station at Liverpool Gateway near the airport. So Liverpool Airport connected, and then into Liverpool itself. And then the idea is to use that railway as a connector for this sort of energy harvesting off the coast. So to actually use that as a channel to deliver energy as well as people. And then every single station would have a development zone, because of course you've got mayoral powers in Liverpool, Manchester, about to get them for Cheshire as well, for Warrington. And effectively, if you can devolve the decision making and partnership on the delivery of the railway, then you allow the mayors and the local powers to be utilised to try and capture the value of land. So it goes back into the development rather than people pocketing the profit. And actually, of course, that all adds to a sort of joined up approach to transport and sort of urban regeneration and development, and not just about putting people sort of into a sort of job, but also getting the skills that they actually need so that they're higher paid jobs as well. And that balances out the UK national economy as well. And that's what railways can do and always have done. So you talk about the railway that was the first intercity railway between Liverpool and Manchester, opened in 1830, huge obstacles in the way of the Stephensons, not least the canal owners, and also the Prime Minister at the time, who thought that it would encourage the working classes to travel. Despite unfortunately killing the local MP on its demonstration day, it opened in its first year, going from 14,000 people using stagecoach between the two cities. You had 445,000 people using it, when actually its primary purpose was freight. So, there's a lot that can be done. Actually, touching on freight, I'll just chuck this one in. The idea is not just to grow the line for passengers, it's actually to grow freight. In this country, a very embarrassing 7% of everything that is transported by freight goes on the rail. More goes on inland water. Over 80% is on road. And again, if we're actually going to sort of sort our cities out in terms of transport, we need to actually get a bigger spine all the way through our railway so that goods are delivered that way, and then the last miles are via road. And again, that's something that we hope Liverpool and Manchester will allow us to develop more of, particularly at the port of Liverpool as well as the airports.
That's a really interesting point. And you say historically and contemporary, it's thinking about the transport intervention or as a way to unlock support further rounds of growth and activity, which is distinct from what we sometimes hear, which is some places are struggling, if we just plugged in a new bit of transport kit, that would sort of revolutionize them or regenerate them. And that that's, I think we need to be a little bit more skeptical about that. But the first set of examples that you gave, which is actually about growth, is already underway, and now we see constraints. We should be much bolder and much quicker to act in those sorts of scenarios, which takes me on to you, Anne, because obviously that's part of your thinking, right, which is in the West Mids, which is how do we intervene through transport, but actually enable and support further rounds of economic activity, housing development, etc., etc. So just say a little bit about that and how that sort of fits together in your sort of big picture about where the West Midlands is and where it's going.
So we've got quite a number of proposals. One of the biggest constraints actually we have on our rail network is that we have Birmingham New Street in the middle of it, and that is already at capacity, obviously national services alongside some regional services as well. So we've been working really hard to help Network Rail and colleagues about how can we take some of those local services out of New Street and put them on local lines as well. So there are proposals like Midlands Rail Hub, which will look at 2 additional cords, which will help us repath some of the existing local train services, and it will also help us with that national capacity as well. Birmingham, like everywhere else, is part of a growing city, as Hugh's just mentioned about Liverpool and Manchester as well. So we need to make sure that we can increase the capacity along our rail network as part of that. We've also got redundant parts of the rail network, which were part of the beaching cuts or other cuts that were made in services. And we've been lovingly restoring some of those to bring back into use through our light rail system as well. So if I mentioned to you that the original powers that came to the West Midlands was back in 1989 to build the 5Ws, so the 5 tram extensions through the West Midlands that would connect a number of our conurbations together. The first line now is over 25 years old, and we've been slowly building on that as well. So, and a number of those extensions have actually come out into the heart of our city, both in Birmingham and in Wolverhampton as well, where we've been connecting more local journeys through to our major train stations as well. We've got other extensions that we're building at the moment, which will reconnect parts of our conurbation to better opportunities. So through Sandwell and Dudley, where I think in Dudley we've got car ownership. So there's about 45% of people who don't have access to a car. So if we're building, just back to Silvia's point around inclusion, if we're building around car journeys, there's a huge exclusion area there. People can't reach employment. So that will completely transform that location. Along that corridor, of course, we've got an investment corridor as well. So lots of locations for new housing. And also new employment sites as well, which we're bringing forward, working with the local authorities to make sure that we can get those investments as well. And then, of course, we're also adding to our rail stock. We've got 5 new stations that we're out constructing at the moment, which will reintroduce some train services in the south of Birmingham, where it's heavily congested, and the buses that are also running on those congested roads are subject to lots of delays, and it gives a really bad experience for people trying to use public transport. So the idea is to open 3 new stations towards the end of this year on the Camp Hill line, which will take about 1 million journeys off the roads and onto local trains for people to get into Birmingham and in the other direction and beyond. And that will help reduce congestion in that location, and it will free up our buses. And of course, we're on the path of taking back control of buses as well, and making sure that we can sort of have that sustainable integrated transport system as part of this. And some of the things that we've been doing around some of the historic stuff on Metro, we've got some real great heritage just going back to the history of the railways as well. So Parkhead Viaduct in Dudley has been restored to its former glory, and later this year, in the next couple of years, it will have trams travelling across it and be brought back into use. It was about 10 years ago shut as a freight line, back to Hugh's point about how do we get more freight on rail as well. So it will come back into use as part of that as well. So there's huge amounts of investment now that we have this longer term funding. We've got a mayoral combined authority, and it will help us unlock access to all of that housing proposals that we've got within our local authority development plans as well.
Brilliant. I'll come to you in a second, Silviya, but just stay with you for a second, Anne, because it touches on Hugh's point when he in his opening comments about London and TfL. Obviously, we now have transport for the West Midlands, transport for other places. I mean, and it's connected to the combined authority, which inevitably then connects to the political leadership. But Anne, is that the real benefit of having a transport for body, in a sense that it can take the big picture, it can integrate different interventions, whether it's housing or transport or the economy, brings a bit of heft and a bit of capacity. Is that the sort of big difference that you've seen since the transport for West Midlands has been introduced?
Yeah, well, Transport for West Midlands is the Transport Authority, and the Transport Authority actually has been around since the 80s, when county councils were dissolved. And over that time, there has been some investment in the early years, but actually it's gone back to how do we create an environment for buses to operate as the Transport Authority? How do we manage national concessionary fares and so on, and less about investment in transport? I think the creation of the combined authorities and wrapping the transport authorities into that allows us to be more strategic. So it's not transport for transport's sake, it's transport and how it delivers through our policies, integrated policies, whether it's the local transport plan or housing policies, our economic policies, how it all comes together in terms of deciding what that pipeline of investment is as part of that. And then really the big change has been the longer term funding that has allowed us to develop that pipeline and to just get on with the delivery of services as well. That's probably been the biggest game changer in all city regions, and obviously everybody's catching up. The Transport Authority obviously does all that coordination and collaboration. It still operates differently to TfL. It's not necessarily the operator of all the services, but we are there to coordinate and collaborate with all of those different transport authorities or transport operators to make sure that it all works as one system.
Yeah, and I think at Connect we've had several questions about why some stuff takes a long time to do, and part of the reason is because we don't have the institutional arrangements to make those decisions and see them through. Silviya, come in on this. I mean, you're advocating for a broader, comprehensive perspective on transport, knitting together active with public, with private. I guess the institutional arrangements are really quite critical to be able to bring those different elements together.
Yes, absolutely. I guess the thing to start with is that we must put people at the center of decision making. It's critical to make sure that people have access to services, goods, obviously education and employment opportunities. And at the moment, many people are pushed into car ownership and pushed into transport poverty, spending a large proportion of their income on private cars just because they have to. They have no other choice. So connecting more people to the public transport network as well as active travel, walking and cycling is very important. The Department for Transport are currently working on a new integrated national transport strategy. And from what they have trailed so far of what they have been hearing from the public consultation is that people really want to have access to public transport and sustainable ways of traveling rather than relying on expensive car ownership. So that has been really encouraging and really positive. And the strategy will look at integrating modes, which is very important to make sure that public transport and active travel is the sort of first choice, that it can compete in terms of ease, comfort, affordability to the private car. So if we can make sure that all these sort of boxes are checked, then we'll make sure that more people are able to choose sustainable transport. But I think the other thing that it would be good if the integrated national transport strategy achieved was much better integration between transport and other policy areas. So transport and health, transport and planning, transport and environment and taxation as well. So much better horizontal integration between different central government departments, but also we need a sort of better alignment, vertical alignment between central government, dissemination to the regional level, to the local authorities as well. And that's why I think the devolution process and the local government reorganization process is very important, because outside of large mayor or combined authorities, many local authorities lack the team capacity, the expertise, the knowledge of how to manage integrated transport systems. And this is really something that we need to address. So the Bus Centre of Excellence was established when the national bus strategy was launched, but now we have a much bigger challenge about integrating across modes. And whereas combined authorities and transport bodies can handle this, many authorities will not. And that's a big worry for us.
Yeah, that's a great point. Hugh, come back in. So you touched on it earlier on in reflecting on some of the work that you did, on the select committee, and Anne touched on this as well. Thinking about Silviya makes a great point about, the broader, bigger challenge. But to stay narrow, as you said, it's not inevitable that the way that our transport usage currently looks, particularly in our big urban areas, there's nothing inevitable about that. There's a series of choices that we have made or haven't made. So, and you also talked a little bit about the sort of supply and demand, or carrots and sticks, Hugh, that we might need to think about. Just, in the urban transport context, big city context, what's your thoughts on, the mix of sticks and carrots that we might need to, how we might need to evolve then to get some of the big gains, the big changes that we're all actually looking for? Hugh, kick us off on that, and I'll get Anne to come in on that as well.
Yeah, and actually it's really interesting with what Anne and the West Midlands are doing, because I've worked closely with the former mayor, Andy Street, who was sort of there during my time with nothing to do with party politics. And, what I sort of comment there is it was really interesting. Whenever I'd have a meeting with Andy Street, or with Andy Burnham, for example, then I was always sort of ready to be pushed very hard on funding and devolution. And I wouldn't say I was terrified when I went into those meetings, but I was ready for a good drilling. In that regards, because they really fought for their combined authority. And when people say, "Oh, well, the problem with mayors is they just look at their own sort of remits," and rail, for example, goes beyond that. Well, I mean, the example for me with Liverpool, Manchester is that all the mayors and the line of route are all there together. Even if you are being cynical about it, the fact is, their voters, their residents actually travel to work or visit other places as well. So of course they're interested in the wider region. So I think it's fantastic what's being done. I'll just give you one example, because I'll come back to it. Road pricing. I just feel that really, we've got an interesting situation with London where it has been used. I think there was a huge amount of political pressure on the London mayor. He didn't back down in terms of the extension on ULEZ, despite his own National Party leader suggesting he should do it at the end of one of the by-election results. And, fair play to him in that sense, because there was a huge amount of pressure. And I'd say this, I live not that far from London. I won't drive into London because my car's 6 months too old for ULEZ. And the last time I drove in London was when I had to pick all my gear up from leaving Parliament, because it's expensive. And why would I? Plus also, that money can then be invested. So, I'm lucky enough to be able to cycle to my train station, put the bike on the train, then I get at the other end and I cycle all around London. That is what I love. But also that's because there's been investment in cycling. And it's safer to do that. I have no issue going around the Elephant and Castle roundabout now, because most of it you're not actually competing with traffic. But if we want to be really brave, because we've got the technology, and if we want to use price as a lever, then look at road pricing and charge per mile. People already charge per mile. They just think that it's Esso ripping them off, rather than sort of 80p a litre, which goes to vehicle excise duty. The fact is about £7 billion is spent on the roads. Fuel duty, I should say. 7 billion comes off vehicle excise duty. Yeah. The 28 billion odd is fuel duty, where people are charged per mile. And if we use telematics and actually charge people, and you could put in, right, I'm going to go from where I am down near Hastings up to Manchester. This is how much it would cost to drive. If I went at a different time, lower congestion, lower emissions, it would charge me this amount. If I had a much more efficient car, I'd have more of a discount. And actually, also, here's how I could buy public transport, all off my phone. That exists right now because young people get discounts off insurance on telematics. And if national government doesn't grasp this, they'll get overtaken, because the regions will bring in their own forms and people won't pay twice for it. So I felt, when I chaired the select committee, that the then government, and certainly the then chancellor, for the obvious reason that we're going to see 35 billion and 80% of that goes schools, hospitals, everything else in terms of tax yield vanish. About 3% of entire tax yields would have gone. So they were in the space for it. But you need brave politicians. And Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, was interested in it, but bottled it. And then it all became the war, standing up for the war against motorists, or whatever it was called. Whereas actually, if it was framed properly, and we talked about using price as a lever, using technology, choice, not being anti-car, but here's the choice. Then we can actually all get to a better place and just be braver than the Daily Mail test, which has always been run to the hills as soon as people say you're getting spied on and you're going to get ripped off as a motorist. Yeah,
very good point. Silviya, you wanted to come in on the road pricing point particularly, but I get Anne to talk a little bit about the broader sort of suite of, the making it slightly more difficult, making it slightly more easier, etc. How do we do that, Silviya?
Yes, very briefly. We have done a in-depth piece of research into pay-as-you-drive, as we call it. I think the big issue that we have at the moment is the transition to electric vehicles is creating a two-tier system. So there's no equivalent of fuel duty for electric vehicles yet. And it's people on higher incomes who are able to afford electric vehicles with driveways who are able to charge at a much lower rate than public chargers. And that is really reducing the cost of transport for many people, but it's the people on low incomes who are not yet able to take advantage of this.
Yeah.
And the issue is that unless we introduce a tax for electric vehicles, that will become progressively cheaper and cheaper for people on higher incomes, and potentially expanding the access to electric vehicles to people on lower incomes. But we need to be really breaking that sort of understanding that electric vehicles will be not charged taxation forever, and really closing that unfairness. There are easy ways to do this. You can introduce a tax just on electric vehicles. It doesn't have to be tiered or based on location. That is something that could potentially be introduced later on, but there are simple ways to just introduce a fuel duty equivalent to electric
Yeah,
vehicles.
that's a good point.
It has to happen before the uptake of EVs grows significantly higher for more people to be affected by this.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. We'll be charging electric vehicles sooner or later, Silviya. We're not allowed to say that yet because that might impede whether people take them up. But we all know that's what we'll have to do. Just need to figure out a way to do it, right? But I mean, I agree with the point that you're definitely making. And just bring us back to the point about making it easier. Having the choices and the options to do more public transport type of thing. That's really quite important, particularly where that choice isn't serious or it's not sufficient or it's not comprehensive. And then how do you reconcile that with what's going on? Obviously Birmingham, that's not West Mids Combined Authority. Birmingham have a clean air zone, a charging one, which is that's not a congestion charge per se, but it kind of is. Just your thoughts on the mix between make it easier, make it harder.
Well, I'm just going to go back to Hugh's point, actually, is that it needs really strong political direction in terms of what the choices are that need to be made as well. So, and I worked on the clean air zone at the very beginning in Birmingham, and it was a really hot topic of war on motorists, etc. But actually, it was a health emergency, and we framed it as a health emergency. The number of people who, die as a consequence of poor air quality, and the thousands of people who suffer from, aggravated asthma and stuff like that as well, and a huge cost to the NHS in terms of looking after those individuals as well. So working very closely with Public Health Director in terms of how can we make this into a different reason, but also because there were a number of communities that were caught within that zone who probably couldn't afford to transition to an alternative cleaner vehicle as well. There was a whole bunch of other measures specifically around supporting local people, local businesses, taxi drivers to transition to cleaner vehicles, etc., as part of that clean air zone. And I think it's not just looking at what's the consequence of bringing a clean air zone, just using it as a stick. It's understanding who it's going to impact and then putting in some mitigations, particularly for those in our communities who need that little bit of extra financial support to help them transition as well, be they a resident or be they a local business, for example. And then I think there's the whole bunch of other measures. Most of the things from our research that we do annually, our travel satisfaction surveys and, feeding off information from Transport Focus. Most people, if they catch the bus, they want it to be reliable. They want it to turn up when it should turn up, but they want it to get to them where they want to get to so they can plan that journey and they can depend on that bus service or that rail service or that tram service as well. So we spent a lot of time and effort actually looking at how can we change the road space, active travel, exactly the same as part of this. So road space reallocation away from multi-lane for cars to dedicated road space for active travel, pedestrians and buses, for example, is another key. Strong political leadership around that as well. And of course, there is the ability to bring in a sort of level of enforcement around some of that as well, particularly on bus lanes. We've been really transparent about that and using any sort of revenue that is raised to feed back into investment into the transport system. And certainly that is also adding local contribution in and allowing us to do some of those things. We're now seeing in some areas improved air quality, reduced congestion, improved bus services, more passengers catching buses than before. So that picture of decline that was showed at the beginning was trying to start to reverse that trend as well. So there are some local levers that we can still use to try to make a difference today, but to bring in the more scale whole ULEZ kind of charge system that we have in London will still take quite strong leadership, and it's not entirely down to mayors in regions. Mayors are part, they lead combined authorities, but they're also made up the leaders of each of the individual councils that are part of that combined authority as well. The decision is a joint one, not a sole one that's made by the mayor in the wider combined authorities.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That is a very good point. We've got 8 or so minutes left. So Hugh, just let's think about you talked about, all three of you have talked about the devolution question and sort of, what's been achieved in different places, and just, laid out some of the examples that devolution has been able and allowed them to do. There's a devolution question and issue in the Liverpool-Manchester sort of project as well. Just, what is it that you would want from government in terms of powers and resources to be devolved down, that, not just in the Liverpool-Manchester example, but just more generally about how do we make progress on the urban transport question? What is it that they're currently holding on to that is better deployed at the local level or the city region level?
So I think what's being held on to is the delivery, and I think that's the sort of that can be a missed opportunity. So the funds are, we've been really sort of making the case for the funding of the railway, and I think we've been successful on that as part of the sort of start of Northern Powerhouse Rail. But what we're now looking for is a different approach on delivery, so a partnership approach between local and central, rather than just sort of this is what you will get and how you'll get it. Because if you don't connect all the powers locally, then it means you don't take full advantage. And I think London on Crossrail was a good example of where that was done well. Not 100% well. I mean, things never are, and there's lessons to be learned there. But with Crossrail, it was absolutely ideal because you had the sort of financing part. So there was a levy on businesses. It's a bit lumpy because if you were sort of just a bit further away from the station that was getting a Crossrail station in, you would end up being in the same sort of funding mechanism as if you were in Croydon. Yeah. But by and large, London business paid in because London business was actually doing well from it. And I think there's good examples there where we can actually do more in terms of the sort of clever financing that allows the region to be the partners on delivery. So the region can then apply all of its powers and ambitions and the things it's also doing right now and tie it all together. And again, you get a bit better business case that way. We know the business cases for rail, are really challenging compared to roads, just the way that the scoring works. So that just really allows you to actually get it over the line, but also actually make it a much better project. Again, it's not just a set of rails, it's actually, a complete game changer around jobs, skills and housing. So I will always come back to devolution because I firmly believe that those in the locality that are elected also actually have the powers, the officials as well. It's not just the politicians, it's the officials being part of the delivery mechanism. If you devolve and work in partnership, not all of it in one go, then you can succeed, and using that blend of expertise. Northumberland line was an interesting one because the sponsor was actually the Northumberland County Council. They're not used to building railways. It was a challenge in some regards because of that reason. It went over budget as well. But they were actually able to utilise their powers and actually put funding in. And actually, that's why they were a good sponsor for it as well. And the Northumberland line, amazing. For those who don't know the area, you go to parts of Northumberland, and even though it's not that far from Newcastle, you just wouldn't go to Newcastle. A lot of young people in particular don't have the car due to the expense, and therefore they don't get their skills where they need it. And the sad thing is there's a big green offshore economy being built in Northumberland. That line is transformational. and 5 times the number of passengers have used it in its first year, and that's before it's even joined up to the metro part of Newcastle, and that was a sort of converting a freight line into a passenger line as well. So, there are examples where you do devolve, work in partnership. The government's talking about doing more in the white paper, but the key is those that have the powers do not readily give them up.
Yes.
And it really is going to require a total culture change and a belief from those that currently have the powers that they can do a better project in terms of delivery and succeed themselves personally if they do it in partnership with the regions.
Brilliant. Okay. Very good. Very good. Agree with that. Silviya, your thoughts on the sort of devolution, what next, as it were, the next steps? Obviously, a lot done, but Hugh's beginning to outline what more. What would your contribution emphasise?
We absolutely support the process of devolution, having much less centralization from government. Local leaders know their area much better as well, so they're in a much better position to identify those projects that need to happen. I think ultimately the sort of success of local leadership is up to the sort of level of ambition to the local leaders. So I think equally important with devolving the powers and the funding is having the right frameworks and structures and sort of outcomes that we want to collectively achieve. So for example, cascading the national net zero pathway to the regional, to the local level, so that we know what needs to be achieved as an overall outcome. Another thing to say is that alongside the capital funding, that is very important to deliver those reconnection projects, big sort of infrastructure that unlocks further sustainable travel, is also the revenue funding that keeps the services going. So if you have a big sort of shiny new bus station, you also need the funding to keep the buses going.
That's right. You need to pay for the buses to come into the shiny new station, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Very good point. Revenue, and it's underlooked, I think, in some respects on the in the transport space, the revenue relative to the capital. And you've had a fair amount. You've done lots with that fair amount. What is it that what would be the next phase in for you in terms of the devolution agenda as it relates to particularly, but not exclusively, the transport agenda?
Well, definitely the partnership now that across housing, skills and economy piece is definitely the direction of travel through devolution, and the ability to actually take a bit more regional control over how some of those investments get made. We've had a very stubborn geography in terms of levels of deprivation across East Birmingham, North Solihull. In fact, if you look at the numbers of people who were impacted by poor connectivity, it's greater than the Oxcam rail corridor. So definitely needs intervention. It's something that I personally have been working on since my days back at the local authority and here as well. But the intervention of a tram extension through some of those more deprived areas that would connect those communities, not just to employment opportunities, but also to their skills training as well, to help them achieve a higher level of skills, qualifications, and into those jobs, and also investment. We've had some announcements recently around a phase one of that through the Birmingham Sports Quarter with Birmingham City Football Club, which is a real catalyst, not just in terms of light rail connectivity and beyond through to into Solihull, where the other HS2 station will be located, but also on the West Coast Main Line, where we'd be looking to improve one of the key train stations there, which at the moment only has one service an hour, but there will be much higher demand in that location once that development comes. And we've also seen with HS2, and I know you didn't want to talk about that, Andrew, but in the West Midlands, we have been fortunate that we are getting a connection, hopefully through to Euston, which will increase our capacity. But the amount of investment that has come on the back of that in the city and around has been immense. And there's lots of development that is going on those corridors, which our tram system will also feed. And what we've also noticed is that from our pessimistic view about how many more passengers we will carry when we open a tram line, actually we achieve that very quickly and go beyond it very quickly as well. It's hugely popular for people who need to use that service as well. So we've got huge investments, huge ambitions. Again, the long-term funding devolution needs to continue. And then on the horizon, the devolution of rail, I totally agree with you that devolution is the key to how do we specify rail services as part of an integrated transport system that builds out the sort of economic, social and environmental outcomes that we want in this region as well. And that's still going to be a tough conversation, just for the comment that Hugh made, which I won't repeat. But how do we work through rail devolution, intermayoral combined authorities, and particularly geography of the rail system in the West Midlands. We're fortunate to have West Midlands Rail Executive. It's bigger than the combined authority, actually covers our journey to work area and picks up a lot of what will become some of those other authorities in the future as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. It's always good to be punctual, but particularly when you're talking about transport, given that's one of the things that people value the most. So we need to finish. We could definitely go on. A quick round of thanks to my panellists, Hugh, to Anne and to Silviya. Thank you for that, and for Caitlin for her presentation earlier on. Thank you all for joining and your loads of great questions. We covered some, but sadly not all of them. And as I said at the beginning, this is part of the Rail200 programme, which you can go onto their website, rail200.co.uk, to find out more details. Undoubtedly, over the next year, we'll come back to this issue on several occasions. But until the next time, thank you and take care and stay safe. Thank you very much.